Hello there, and welcome to Nowhere to Hide. Today, we're going to be talking about how to slow the growth of government in Idaho. Now, why would someone want to slow the growth of government? Isn't it the source of everything that makes our lives worthwhile? To some people, perhaps, but to the taxpayers, actually, they could use a little bit of relief, and we'll tell you exactly how they could get some with just a little more responsibility on the part of their elected leaders.
Press club or bias all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Once again, welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm Brian Hyde, and I'm very happy to sit down with you twice a week to go over some of the issues and some of the things that we face in Idaho that matter. Being political, sometimes they're not covered in great detail by the legacy media, or sometimes they need just a little bit closer look. Now, before we talk about how to rein in government growth, starting with reining in its spending, I have to spend a couple of moments talking about ranked choice voting. I'm sorry, I'm going to do this every time up until the election because it's, first of all, it's something that actually counts. And it's an issue that's going to be before a lot of people who may or may not be as well informed. And secondly, it really irritates the proponents of ranked choice voting. So here goes. First of all, I got to give kudos to Brian Allman. Wonderful text here as he shared a piece by Douglas Wills. This was kind of a great line here. Jungle primaries and ranked choice voting are not the same thing. They're not the same bad idea. Rather, they are two very distinct bad ideas that have been bundled into one. And I want to share just a quick excerpt from Doug Will's excellent piece, which you should be able to very easily find online. Why are they pushing so hard for ranked choice voting, those people and organizations that seem determined to put this on the ballot and want it to pass so badly? Well, the answer is the old Idaho has got to go. And here's his explanation. Doug says, in statewide elections in Idaho, the progressive left does not actually stand a chance. That is, they don't stand said chance when each political party picks their guy and then the Idaho voters choose between the two. So the clear purpose of Prop 1 is to enable the left to win statewide elections in a state where otherwise, as a New York cab driver might say, forget about it. They intend to do this by means of electoral ratcheting. So, do the Boise Pride Fest people want this? Oh, they do. Do all the left-wing lawyers want it? They do. Do those neighborhoods that have yard signs promoting various commie miscreants also have a lot of yard signs propping up urging a vote on yes on Prop 1? They do. That's actually all you need to know. There's a lot of truth in that, by the way. You can tell a lot about a measure by who supports it. The rhino establishment Republicans, the ones who run as Republicans but actually tend to govern as Democrats, they're all for this because they know their days are numbered because the Idaho voters are catching on to them and don't want to surrender the conservative values that have made this such a great state and an island of freedom in an otherwise rapidly becoming unfree nation. So, get as informed as you can, but that's another great bit of information to keep in mind. Let's talk about slowing government growth. And this is particularly an excellent piece by Fred Birnbaum from the Idaho Freedom Foundation about a roadmap for ending property taxes. Now, this is kind of number heavy, so I don't want you to get a glazed look in your eyes. Oh boy, there's numbers and this is so hard to follow. Fred does a marvelous job of explaining the issue as well as explaining the solution to slowing government growth and reducing its need to tax so much of our money away from us. He writes that Governor Little recently issued a press release claiming that since assuming office in 2019, his administration cut taxes paid by Idaho residents by $4.6 billion cumulative through 2025. Now, that figure includes income tax cuts, property tax reductions, one-time rebates, an increase to the grocery credit, a child care deduction, and a reduction in unemployment taxes. So according to the governor, approximately two-thirds of the $4.6 billion in cuts are ongoing. The ongoing portion is nearly $1 billion annually, about a 10% cut from all revenue sources, which includes all major revenues, that is, to state and local governments. But here's where it gets a little bit tricky. Cutting taxes by billions of dollars, he says, it's a notable achievement both the governor and the legislature should be proud of. Now, he says, just to be clear, despite what leftists tell you, the tax cuts didn't lead to starving the government of your money. In fact, tax collections grew dramatically. Yes, taxes have been cut dramatically, but tax revenue growth has been limited to inflation plus, but had tax revenue growth been limited to inflation plus population growth, we could have eliminated property taxes over the last decade. Now, if you're a property owner, this is something that should make you sit up and take notice. Here's how that could happen. So, Fred Birnbaum writes, if you're following the math, one logical question is, what would tax collections have been in 2023 if total tax growth had been held to a 26% increase between 2019 to 2023? And the answer is about $8.2 billion, or roughly $1.3 billion lower than the $9.5 billion it was in 2023. Now, putting that into perspective, the total property tax revenues in 2023 were $2.2 billion. So limiting tax collections to population plus inflation over a 4-year period would have cut enough spending to allow Idaho to eliminate roughly 60% of property taxes. I mean, would you object to that? I would hope not. Total tax collections to state and local governments have increased from 6.5 billion in 2019 to 9.5 billion in 2023. That's the last year for comprehensive data, and that's over 2.5 times the increase in the consumer price index, which is the most common measure of inflation. And yes, the population has increased about 8% over the same period, so when we add inflation to population, it comes out to roughly 26%. Yet even with the tax cuts, total tax collections are up 46%. Now, these are differences that matter, Fred writes. Tax collections are nearly double what inflation and population growth would dictate. They have more money than they need. But Idaho didn't limit its taxing or its spending. So where did that extra money go? Glad you asked. He says, I think you know the answer. It was either spent or it was allocated to government reserve accounts. So, for example, if you review the total state appropriations, excluding federal funds, county and local expenditures, they were $5.4 billion in fiscal year 2019 and increased to $7.4 billion in fiscal year 2023. So that's an increase of 37%. Now, how could all of this have worked differently? Well, Fred says, just as an example, in fiscal year 2023, over $300 million in sales tax revenue was provided to county and local governments. Now, there's nothing sacrosanct about this amount. Sales taxes pulled in over $3 billion in fiscal year 23. Had less money been spent on state appropriations, some of the extra sales tax revenue could have been used to displace property taxes. But this only works if spending growth at the state, county, and local levels had been held to inflation growth plus population. You're starting to see where this idea could actually save the taxpayers considerably. So, as an example, this exercise isn't just a policy prescription, but rather a rough example to show how ambitious tax relief is possible, including eliminating an entire class of taxes if proper spending restraint had been exercised. So there's the challenge before the legislature. How do you exercise that proper spending restraint? Now, Ron Nate, president of the Idaho Freedom Foundation, actually takes a crack at this and has a wonderful piece. You can find both of these at idahofreedom.org. And I'll share a couple of excerpts from his piece here in just a moment. Fred concludes with, this analysis compares the changes in revenue and spending for just a few years. If we were to extend this analysis to the decade coming out of the financial crisis of 2008-2009, we could have eliminated property taxes entirely. If Idaho had simply restrained spending to inflation plus population growth, then the dream of eliminating property taxes could have been a reality by now. How so? At least since the fiscal year 14, state and local revenue collections were $4.9 billion. Grow that by inflation plus population growth until fiscal year 2023, and revenues would have been $7.2 billion. And that would have been $2.3 billion less than the actual state and local revenues of $9.5 billion, which would be enough to erase property taxes. Now, let's add Ron Nate's voice to this. He talks a little bit about how we can, if you want tax cuts, you've got to stop the spending. And here's what he recommends. He says, there's an analogy here. Mighty oaks seem to grow by more than they're fed. Now, how is that so? Well, water, nutrients, and air all add to their growth, but a botanist can tell you how such large trees can come from relatively smaller inputs. Similarly, Idaho's budget growth far outpaces what supposedly fuels it. If you look at the natural increases in state population and higher prices and compare those to Idaho's budget, then you'll see that Idaho's government is outpacing what's supposed to be possible in a conservative red state. So again, the reminder here is if you want to shrink government, you've got to shrink spending. And Ron says one positive change would be put a cap on budget growth at the population increase plus inflation rates. So at the maximum, Idaho's government stays proportional to what seems necessary. Truly, though, to counteract the previous year's bloat, he says we should be reducing government spending for the near term. Government wants to grow, but we shouldn't overfeed it with Idahoans' hard-earned tax dollars or with the federal government's make-believe or borrowed dollars. I love this last line, starve the beast. So does that strike you as a terribly radical thing? Why we should be giving every penny that we have to government. After all, it's the source of our joy and our happiness. But is it really? I'm willing to bet that you could probably take that money, if you're a property owner, you could take that money if we were to eliminate the property tax and put it to productive use in some way that you deem beneficial. Maybe you donate it to charity. Maybe you create something of value. Maybe you just go have fun and take a cruise somewhere. The point is, it's your money. Don't you think you would have a better sense of where it could best be used than simply handing it over to bureaucrats and letting them either sock it away for a rainy day or simply spend it to make sure that it's going to state programs? Something to consider, and hopefully this is something that legislators, as they conduct the budgetary process, will give it some strong consideration as well. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
Press Club or bias all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot.
That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.